What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-800-585-9396.
What's stopping?
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-800-585-9396.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Wednesday edition of Call to Communion. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Hey, if that's you and you've got a question about the Catholic faith, here is an excellent place to get that question answered. Just call 1-800-585-9396, 1-800-585-9396. If you're a texter type person, you can text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for the response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. Again, the phone number 1-800-585-9396. Michael McCall is our producer. Matt Kabinski is handling phones. Jeff Burson, back from his week with his beautiful wife to visit our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. He's back. He's handling social media, so you can also ask your questions via YouTube and Facebook. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm great, and glad to have our friend Jeff back in the saddle.
Me too.
He spent, I think, he and his wife Lisa spent pretty much the whole week at the Smithsonian.
Yeah, well, I think a week doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of it, right?
It really doesn't. But we're delighted to have him back. I want to lead off with a very interesting email today. This is from, well, you know what? There's no name. So this is from Handball 8072.
I once knew a woman named No Music.
No Music?
No Music. I said, how do you spell that? She said, N-O-M-U-S-I-C, No Music.
Are you kidding me?
Nope.
That's amazing. So here's the letter from Handball 8072. I am a Protestant and have really enjoyed your program. Your show and EWTN programming are allowing me to become open to the possibility of joining the Catholic Church.
Oh, it's a good step.
Praise God. I have been studying the stigmata, Marian apparitions, and Eucharistic miracles. Are there any mention of these supernatural events among the Reformers? If there are, do the Reformers explain them away? I think I have heard you say that Martin Luther believed in the real presence of Jesus. Was he or any other Reformer aware of the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano or of Marian apparitions? Why don't Protestants today know about all these historical and ongoing supernatural events that seem to give witness to the truthfulness of the Catholic Church?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. The Reformers were very well aware of Catholic claims to miracles. They were very well aware of them. And in fact, it was one of the things that got thrown in their face quite frequently because the Catholic position was, look, you guys are advocating such a radical change in the understanding and practice of the Christian faith. When God instituted the new covenant in Jesus, and it was a change from the administration of the Mosaic covenant, he demonstrated the truth of that change, the authority for that change, with powerful signs and miracles, not the least of which was the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and then followed up with the miracles of the apostles. Where are your miracles? How is it that you can claim divine authority for these innovations that you're bringing to the Christian faith? Would you demonstrate them with signs and wonders? And so the Reformers had to answer that charge. And what they did is they elaborated for the first time in Christian history an idea called cessationism. And they said, well, no, it's an illegitimate claim because you see. This is the Protestant Reformers talking. They say, you see, God used miracles at the time of the New Testament in order to validate the preaching of the gospel, but once that got rolling, the necessity for miracles as signs testifying to the truth of the gospel ceased. Right now, they would be redundant or irrelevant or a distraction, and so God doesn't do miracles anymore. That was the claim. All right, and since we're just preaching, we're advocating a return to that original biblical gospel. At least that's the way they saw it.
Sure.
It's illegitimate for you to demand that we perform miracles. And oh, by the way, all of your miracle claims are spurious. They're all fakes.
Wow.
Right? And that's the position they articulated. And that became the Protestant sort of standard Protestant line down through the centuries, with a few historical exceptions. In the early 18th century, there was a group of Reformed Protestants in the Cevennes in southern France that came to be known as the French prophets, and they were kind of sort of proto-Pentecostals, and they would prophesy and speak in tongues and do this kind of business. And they eventually immigrated to London and made kind of a brouhaha over there. The Quakers, of course, in the Quaker movement also would claim miracles and prophecies and so forth. And so you have disparate groups throughout history within Protestantism. They were typically on the fringes that would claim this kind of thing. It began to gain steam a little bit in the 19th century. There was a healing movement that got cranking in Anglo-American Protestantism in the 19th century that kind of coalesced with the holiness movement, and then eventually gave birth to modern Pentecostalism around the turn of the century, around 1900. And then, of course, the Pentecostals had to take on that Reformed doctrine of cessationism. There's actually a pretty decent book on the topic by John Ruthven, Ruthven, who is a Pentecostal scholar. He's not a Catholic. And I can't remember the title of the book, but it's something like The Reformed Doctrine of Cessationism. And it's a critique of that, and he actually gives the history of the evolution of that doctrine from within the Protestant point of view. A big 19th century Protestant who was a big cessationist was B.B. Warfield, professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, who took great aim at all claims to miracles. But that's not the historic view, of course. In the New Testament itself never says anything about miracles ceasing, and doesn't particularly announce that miracles exist only as signs. Right? They can also be an expression of God's mercy, as he heals the sick or instructs the faithful or leads and guides them by the Holy Spirit in amazing ways. So they don't have simply that significatory aspect to them that the Reformed claimed. And the Catholic Church has always proclaimed that God continues to work miracles in the lives of his faithful down to the present day. Now, the important distinction in the Catholic doctrine on miracles is that the revelation that we need to be saved is the one that came in Christ. Jesus is the definitive revelation. And so everything that pertains to the public teaching of the church, proclaimed as gospel, is there in the teaching of Christ and the apostles. Any claim to miracle that happens after that period of time, after that period of history, is what we call a private revelation. And God may, if he chooses, send a saint or an angel, or he himself could speak to a holy person or an unholy person, for that matter, to give some particular instruction for that person's edification or that community's edification. But that's not part of the public teaching of the church. It's not part of the gospel, and so Catholics are not bound to believe those things. Gotcha.
Okay. Very good. Hope that's helpful for you. When we come back from our quick break, we'll get to the phones here. 1-800-585-9396 if you have a question for Dr. David Anders. 1-800-585-9396. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN.
Sharing the fullness of the Catholic faith. 1-800-585-9396. This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
This is Cy Kellett, host of Catholic Answers Live.
This is Jeanette DeMello, host of Register Radio.
This is Bishop Robert Barron of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. Thanks for listening to EWTN Radio.
Father Robert Spitzer.
First of all, you will get a much deeper awareness of your faith, much deeper awareness of the evidence for your faith, explanations of tough theological issues, how science and reason and faith come together, and above all, a deeper awareness of how to practice your faith and how to live it.
Father Spitzer's Universe with Father Robert Spitzer. Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Missing Catholic radio in your area? Heed God's call to get involved and start a Catholic radio station. Contact Jack Williams, 205-795-5756, or email jwilliams@ewtn.com.
Living the Beatitudes with Father Bjorn.
Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. While purity is an important virtue, a lot of times we can confuse this beatitude for a discussion about sexual morality. To be pure in heart is to be completely focused on and in love with God. God has given us an invitation deep within us to share in his own divine life. But it's important that we choose to focus on him and respond to that invitation. In a homily on the Mount of Beatitudes in 2000, St. John Paul the Great says that We are called to have an urgent response to choose between life and death. In one of the earliest known Christian documents on morality, the Didache, it says there are two ways, one of life and one of death. And between the two ways is a great difference. God has called us to be focused on Him and His love. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-800-585-9396.
If you're ready now, let's get to the phones at 1-800-585-9396. We begin with Ian in Denver, listening on Denver Catholic Radio. Hello there, Ian. What's on your mind today?
Yeah, hey, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I called in, so I'll try not to ramble. I called in yesterday, and I wasn't able to get through, but I was listening to the show, and you were talking about, well, I don't know if it was you, but you were talking about molism and predestination and grace and efficacious grace.
Right.
And what I understood from the show was that everybody gets sufficient grace, but you need efficacious grace to make it to heaven. And not everybody gets efficacious grace, and we can't credit free will for why some people get it, why some people don't. Hence the Jesuit idea that, God can see possibilities, and He chose to give it to the people because it brings about the greatest good. And I was thinking, how is that different from, how is God not choosing the souls to go to hell by omitting the graces that they need to get there? And it actually bugged me so much. I kept researching, and I ended up calling a later show. And Tim Staples kind of cleared it up with a paragraph from Gaudium et Spes. He said that regardless, it can get fuzzy with all the different theologians on this stuff, but that the Church says every man and person has a real opportunity to participate in salvation. And I just wanted to call back, as I said I would, and I thought maybe somebody was thinking along the same lines as me.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate the question. Well, I'm familiar with Gaudium et Spes. I know the passage that Tim Staples had in mind, but of course, Gaudium et Spes doesn't really speak to the issue of efficacious grace and predestination. It's just not a topic that comes up for discussion in the document. And the Catholic Church has always taught that the offer of grace is universal, and in fact, Gaudium et Spes emphasizes the universality of the offer far more, I think, than many other documents in church history, so much so that it explicitly teaches that the offer of grace is made even to those that don't have explicit knowledge of Christ, okay? And that's very important, all right? Now, the Church also teaches that grace can be resisted, okay? And the Church also teaches that that not everybody goes to heaven, right? So there is a hell. It's a dogma of the Catholic faith that hell exists as a real place. Some people end up there, okay? Now, the Church also teaches that the gift of perseverance, that is to say, okay, what if I'm living the Christian life and loving God and loving neighbor, that's not creditable to me, right? That's because of God's grace active in my life, even though it presumes my free cooperation, okay? Now, it's possible for me to stop cooperating with God's grace, to lose that grace, to fall away and be lost. So the grace once given could be lost through my own sin, which is, of course, due to my own human freedom, all right? So then if one person does not lose the grace and makes it to the end and is saved, and another person does lose the grace and does not make it to the end and is lost, do we credit that distinction simply to the human side of the equation? Or does the question of the dispensation of God's grace and our making it to the finish line, so to speak, also fall within the dispensing of God's providence? Does God really control everything, right? And that's another dogma of the Catholic faith. Jesus says, not a sparrow falls apart from the will of God. God is superintending everything that happens so that there are no surprises, not just because of God's foreknowledge, but because of God's active control of human history. He really is in control of everything. So that if somebody perseveres in the faith unto the end, all right, not only have they not merited that gift of perseverance, but God has providentially determined to give it. And we can pray for perseverance. We're told to pray for perseverance. In fact, the Hail Mary has a prayer for perseverance embedded in it. This is a prayer that every Catholic prays every day. Pray for us sinners now in the hour of our death. Amen. We desire that grace of final perseverance. And it can't be merited. We cannot merit the beginning of grace. That's a dogma of the Catholic faith. All right. So there was a heresy in the 5th century called semi-Pelagianism. And semi-Pelagianism worked like this. It said that God offers grace to everybody. Some people freely respond to that offer, others don't, all right? And the difference between those who start on the path of life and those who don't start on the path of life is that free human decision to accept grace, all right? And then grace, once given, does the rest of the job. And the Synod of Orange said, and I think it's about 529, that nope, that's wrong, all right? That even the free determination to accept the gift of grace is itself a work of grace. All right, so there's at no point at the beginning of our lives can we credit our free human action irrespective of God's providential design or his grace. Okay, so that He is moving our wills even to say yes. Okay, so the beginning of the Christian life is due to grace, and we can't credit our merit for the fact that we persevere. So if I make it to the end of the show, I can't look back and say, what a great guy I am. Look how I cooperated, and Tom over here didn't cooperate, right? So I made it to the end because I cooperated, and he doesn't. No, church says it's not right. It's not right. That if we make it to the end, that perseverance in the faith is also a work of grace, and not everybody perseveres. But free will is real, and grace can be resisted. Now, those are a lot of theses that are all held in tension by Catholic theologians, and they've all been dogmatically defined. So then the question comes up, well, how do I square all of those? Okay, that's a good question. That's a good question. And there's basically two ways you can try to square them. All right, you can start from the top down, and you can begin with God's providential control of history and kind of, work your way down. All right. Or you can start with the bottom up, and you can begin with the dogma on human freedom and responsibility and kind of work your way up. All right. Someplace, the movement from the top down and the bottom up run into conflict, and there's a zone of mystery there. Well, guess what? The Catholic faith is full of mysteries. God is three in one. Christ has two natures. The Eucharist looks like bread but isn't. I mean, we're loaded up with mysteries. Got no shortage of mysteries. Someplace, those two dynamics between human freedom and divine providence run into the mystery zone. All right. Now, if you find a way to perfectly rationally reconcile those so that no tension remains, you've probably zoomed off into a heresy. All right, and that's generally the truth with most of the dogmas. I mean, if you say, I've got a way to explain the Trinity so that there's no more intellectual difficulty in recognizing this dogma, I've fixed it, well, you've probably fallen into one of the classic Trinitarian heresies, right, which were all attempts to render a mystery in perfectly rationally intelligible terms, right? And so there's an element of mystery here between divine providence and human freedom. Now, there have historically been different attempts to work out that tension. Now, there's a famous controversy in the late 16th century between the Jesuits and the Dominicans precisely over this issue of efficacious grace. And they kept kind of pointing the finger and calling each other heretics. One side would accuse the other of being crypto-Calvinists and fatalists and determinists, and the other side would accuse them of being Pelagians and semi-Pelagians and overstressing human freedom. And they had this meeting with the Pope. It was called the Congregatio Dei Auxiliis over the doctrine of efficacious grace. And the Pope sat there and he listened to both sides. And he said, okay, here's what we're going to do. You guys shut up. Quit calling each other heretics. Go back to your schools and teach theology. I'm going to sit on this one and think about it. I'll render my decision. And then you'll get your answer. You just wait on me. Go back and keep teaching theology in the meanwhile. It's been 500 years.
This is one of my favorite stories of Catholicism.
It's been 500 years.
I love it.
And we hadn't heard anything out of the magisterium. Okay. Pope said, beats me, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's nice about that, right, is it points out that within the Catholic faith there is allowable diversity of opinion on some issues. When the Church defines a dogma, like the dogma of the Blessed Trinity, well, that's off the table now. Okay, we now know something definitive about the nature of God. One in essence, three in person. All right, but that's no longer open for dispute. Okay, efficacious grace and free will, divine providence, have at it.
Yeah.
Do your best.
Sure. Ian, thank you so much for your call. We hope that is helpful for you. Hey, that opens up a line for you now, 1-800-585-9396 if you have a question for Dr. David Anders. 1-800-585-9396. We're going to stay in Denver and talk with Michael, listening to us on Denver Catholic Radio. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I had a question for Dr. Andrews. I'm an Orthodox Christian, not a very good Orthodox Christian, but I just, my whole family has always sort of had a tense relationship with Catholics in general. We're very distrustful of Catholics, and I'm sort of wondering why that is. I don't really, like I said, I don't go to church every Sunday. And one thing that I've heard from my family is that they think that the Catholic Church is too worldly, like it's too concerned with politics, and they basically say that the Catholic Church fell for the second temptation of Christ at the Garden of Gethsemane, that it wanted to become a worldly empire, and that it's sort of a kind of, it doesn't fit with Christian sort of mysticism that is more present in Orthodoxy. And I guess I'll take my answer off the line, but thank you.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the call. Yes, those are common Orthodox complaints about the Catholic Church, and I understand all those. So let me take them one at a time. So first of all, do I think that the Catholic Church is too worldly? Absolutely. Of course. Yeah, certainly. All right. Does that mean that no Orthodox patriarch has ever been worldly? I'm not going to name names and point fingers, but I mean, there's a history of church hierarchs all over the Christian world who have abused their offices for personal gain or been involved in politics, and that's as true of Orthodoxy as it is of Catholicism. Is the church too worldly? You're darn right. Sure is, right? And in fact, this is why within Catholicism there have been reform movements, some of them from the bottom up, some of them from the top down, some of them instituted by popes themselves, to try to continually battle against the temptation to careerism or corruption or nepotism or whatever it might be. Now, when it comes to whether the church has a specific vocation to intervene in the secular or the civil realm and to speak to matters of, say, public policy or social doctrine, well, there I would have to say I think that Christ specifically commissions this kind of activity, and there's powerful biblical and historical warrant for the idea that the gospel is not simply a message of personal salvation, but of societal redemption. Now, it's not a redemption that'll ever be fully realized. The individual person can be fully saved and go to heaven. Society as such is not going to be fully saved and go to heaven. We're not going to have, like the American club in heaven. Well, all the Americans that made it there, or the U.S. Constitution is not going to be enshrined, hanging on the wall in some palatial mansion in the next life. Civilizations as such are not going to be saved. That doesn't mean that the church doesn't have a valid mission to try to work for human flourishing and justice. I mean, this is a constant theme throughout the Old and New Testament. And I think the fruits of that historically have been overwhelmingly positive. So, to take one example, the Fourth Lateran Council ruled that priests should not be involved in validating or administering trials by ordeal. All right, and the trial by ordeal, of course, is a pagan import into Western judicial practice, and of course the thing is ridiculously unjust and irrational and superstitious. The church opposed trial by ordeals, and as a result of the church's opposition, they got rid of trial by ordeal, and instead we began to see the development of a sane, rational civil procedure with things like the presumption of innocence and the standards of the reasonable doubt and trial by jury and all these kinds of innovations, which were developed within the Catholic Church and the Catholic canon law courts. Well, is that something the church shouldn't do, really shouldn't work for, say, human rights and individual liberty and justice and freedom of conscience and sane civil procedure? Well, I mean, obviously these things are an outgrowth of the doctrine of the dignity of the human person made in the image and likeness of God. All right? So I think that's a perfectly legitimate kind of intervention into the civil realm, regardless of the fact that some pope or other may have been too given to political machinations or had his own self-aggrandizement in view. Well, too bad for him. Maybe he didn't get canonized. He didn't make it to heaven, you know?
Yeah.
In terms of the church seeking a worldly empire, come visit my diocese sometime in Birmingham, Alabama. You'll see a church that's about as far from exercising worldly dominion as any place on the planet, okay? Right. Go hang out with some of the Chinese bishops who have been languishing in prison for decades precisely because they have resisted the amalgamation of the church into a worldly empire and have called for the spiritual dominion of Christ over the hearts of men and have suffered with their lives to death.
Yep, absolutely. Michael, thank you so much for your call. We hope that is helpful for you. When we come back, we will talk with a whole bunch of folks, Alicia, Mike, Lori, and Jane, and there's one line open for you right now, 1-800-585-9396. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. Stay with us.
EWTN News Nightly with Lauren Ashburn.
As a journalist, I held people accountable, and that's what I want to do here. I want to hold government, politicians, leaders, moral leaders accountable for the actions that they take, and to do it in a way that gives our Catholic audience something new that they would not find anywhere else.
EWTN News Nightly with Lauren Ashburn, weekdays at 9 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
It's time for Family Man with Dr. Gregory Popchak.
Did you know there are two kinds of tantrums? The first type, distress tantrums, are the most common in children 4 and under. They aren't the result of children trying to manipulate you as much as your kids being overwhelmed, overstimulated, or frustrated. The best cure for distress tantrums is bringing your child to a quiet place and providing lots of loving attention to help your child calm down and come back online. The second type, manipulative tantrums, occur in children who are old enough to have good self-control but still use drama as a tool. The best way to respond to these tantrums is to calmly place the child in a quiet, safe timeout place until he's calm enough to apologize sincerely, accept your direction, and rehearse the more appropriate alternative with you. How long are they in for? Well, that's up to them. Want more tips to make discipline easier? Check out my book, Parenting with Grace. I'm Dr. Greg Popchak, but you can call me Ben.
To discover more ways faith can enrich your life, visit CatholicCounselors.com.
Father Wade Menezes talks about the National Catholic Register.
As the National Catholic Register celebrates its 90th anniversary, I think that says a lot about the publication. It presents the teachings of the Church, unabashedly so, and also guides its readers to be even more solidly Catholic themselves.
For a 6-issue free trial of the National Catholic Register, go to ncregister.com and click on the 6 free issue banner, or call 800-421-3230 for your 6 free issues.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Andrews. 1-800-585-9396.
Hey, there's great radio straight ahead today. In 30 minutes, can you believe it? It's the one and only Father Mitch Pacwa talking about church teachings on EWTN Open Line Wednesday. That's 3 p.m. Eastern. Today at 4 on Cresta in the afternoon, Dr. Anthony Rizzi stops by. His topic, Thinking Clearly About the World as a Catholic. And also Mustafa Akyol speaks on his article, A Proposal for Islam.
Anthony Rizzi is the bomb.
Is he?
He could also make the bomb because he is a theoretical physicist.
I like the way you think. Anyway, that's today at 4 o'clock Eastern on Cresta in the afternoon. And then tonight at 8, EWTN Live with Father Mitch talks with Dr. Carrie Gress, exploring the many times throughout history that Our Lady has interceded on behalf of her children.
I thought you were going to say Cary Grant there for a second.
No, that'd be Carrie Gress.
Okay.
So we can all learn a lot. That'll be tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. and television. There you get your computer back.
Thank you.
We've had some computer...
I was about to have one of those tantrums that Dr. Popchak was talking about.
As
a frustration tantrum.
Well, as our Facebook and YouTube folks have probably figured out, we had some computer issues here, which we have now resolved, thanks to our wonderful IS department. So we're going to get right back to the phones here at 1-800-585-9396. Alicia is listening to us in Philadelphia on Holy Spirit Radio. Alicia, what's on your mind today?
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. I was like shaking during the commercial.
Oh, we are delighted that you called in. What's on your mind today?
Okay, well, my mom has this friend who's born again.
Mm-hmm.
So don't get me started on like all of her, there is no purgatory, you guys have the wrong Bible, and all that kind of stuff. But
Yikes.
the one that actually I haven't really heard that much about was my mom. I think they were in a store, and my mom was looking at necklaces with the crucifix.
Mm-hmm.
And when she saw my mom looking at them, she said, "Why are you looking at a crucifix? Like, why are you wanting to buy one with a crucifix?" And my mom said, "Well, because I want one, and like I'm Catholic." And she's like, "Well, that's putting like emphasis on his death, and Jesus was resurrected. Like, that's not what we're supposed to be focusing on." So when I heard about it, I thought, well, when we have the crucifix, we're looking at all three of the life, death, and resurrection when we look at a crucifix. It's not just the cross that saved us, it's the man on the cross that saved us. So a cross is pretty much an incomplete symbol of Catholicism, or at least Christianity in general. Is that like a proper way of thinking about it? And is there more, because she's, sola scriptura?
Yeah,
so is there something from the Bible we can pull from that?
Sure. I appreciate it. Yes, thank you. So there's a very, very important Catholic teaching that most Protestants actually reject, okay, but it's very, very biblical, and I'd like to direct you to it. And it's the teaching that if we don't suffer, we won't be saved. If we don't suffer, we won't be saved. And Jesus teaches this explicitly. He says in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it."
He didn't say take up your pillow.
He didn't say take up your pillow, okay? And the notion that we are to sacrifice and suffer is absolutely essential to our participation in the gospel. St. Paul says in the book of Galatians, chapter 6, "May I never boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus." He tells us in the book of Romans, chapter 12, he says, "I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies," and that language, offering, is a sacrificial term, "offer your bodies as living sacrifices." This is your rational act of worship. And of course, in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, we read that just as we share abundantly, we share in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. And he tells us in Colossians 1, St. Paul says, "I make up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ in my own body for the sake of his body, the church." All right, that there is a real participation in Christ that takes place by our uniting our sufferings to his sufferings on the cross. Hence, St. Paul tells us, "I boast in nothing except the cross of Jesus." Now, the crucifix is not just a reminder to us of what Jesus did on our behalf. It is also a constant witness of the kind of life that we must live to imitate him. And it's also a tremendous comfort, you see, because suffering is a pervasive fact of human life. There's no getting away from it.
Can't.
I got a bad headache right now. I came in with one, and that's fortunately, I got a few other problems going on in life. A lot of people suffer worse than a bad headache, but there's no getting away from suffering, okay? Now, is it meaningful or not? Is it ultimately meaningful or not? Now, if you maintain that we do not share in the sufferings of Christ, that this plays no role in our redemption, and the ultimate meaning of human life is heaven, then you've just admitted that, well, my suffering is of no ultimate value because it doesn't contribute in any way to my participation in Christ to the everlasting life. Well, that's, at least some Protestants take that point of view. Well, I mean, the best you can offer someone in suffering, pastorally, right, if you hold that view is, well, it'll end one day and you'll go to heaven. Well, look at the position that the Catholic is in, pastorally. You're comforting someone who is afflicted, or perhaps you yourself are afflicted. Yes, you can look forward to the hope of heaven, but you also have the confidence, this trial that I'm facing right now is in fact an instrumental cause. It is a means that God has given me to enable me to participate in that life of heaven. And if I, like Jesus, say, not my will but thine be done, or like the Blessed Virgin Mary, be it done to me according to thy word, and I willingly surrender to God's providence and accept the cross that Jesus gives me, the Catholic faith tells me that it's that act of resignation to the divine will, the suffering that comes in my life right now, that is in fact the means of my participating in the cross of Christ and ultimately entering into redemption. And not only does it bring about my salvation, but the merit, the reward that is due such resignation can be dispensed on behalf of his body, the church. St. Paul says, I make up in my own flesh what's lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. And hence, this Catholic practice you sometimes hear of called offering it up, I haven't done this. Perhaps I should offer my headache for Tom and his family today.
Wouldn't that be a nice thing to do?
And the faith actually says there's a value and an efficacy in that exceeds just saying a prayer. I mean, I can pray for Tom, Adrienne, Spencer all day long, and Gus, and what's the other one?
Addie,
right, the two dogs.
The dogs.
I can pray for them all day long. The church says, but when you've joined your sufferings to that prayer, it becomes even more efficacious, you see. And so when we meditate on the crucifix, yes, we think about what Christ suffered on our behalf. That inflames us to love and compassion and appreciation and gratitude to God. But it also inspires us to obey the words of Jesus, to take up our crosses and follow him.
Alicia, a great call. Please call us back sometime. Our phone number here, 1-800-585-9396. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Mike is listening in San Antonio on the EWTN app, which is, by the way, a free download, EWTNapps.com. Just thought I'd throw that in. Mike, what's on your mind today?
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I'm always curious on some of my Protestant friends, and one that just really always sticks out to me is the once saved, always saved theology.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping that you can really, in two-part, identify who are some of the key denominations that practice this theology, and then where does this come from? Because everything, when I read the Bible every day, the New Testament, I read overwhelmingly just the opposite. So I'm trying to understand their perspective, not so much to argue with them, but just really to kind of understand.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I really appreciate the question. So this begins in the mind and the spirituality of Martin Luther, who in the 15 teens, was a really distressed young man who was constantly worried about the state of his soul and found no comfort or confidence towards God. And there's a great book by a Jesuit historian about Luther called Luther, Man Yearning for Grace by Jared Wicks. And the title says it all. It's a beautiful title, Man Yearning for Grace. And in fact, Luther's focus in the Christian life during that period of his life was almost entirely sort of introspective. Very little development of, say, social concern or the church at large. It was all about, how do I know I'm going to heaven? How do I know I'm going to heaven? I mean, neurotically so. And I think if you were to kind of diagnose him today, you'd probably say he was OCD or manic depressive or something. I mean, it's just really this kind of neurotic obsession with the question of his own salvation. And when he talks about his theological method later in life, he's very overt. He's very explicit about the fact that he doesn't work his theology out just from the Bible, but from the crucible of his own experience. He once said, it's not reading and studying, it's living and dying and being damned that makes a theologian. He talks like that, okay? And so the issue of how can I find a gracious God and be certain of my salvation was what really motivated him. And in that light, he comes up with a very novel, innovative, and never before heard of interpretation of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans and to the Galatians. And you've heard, I'm sure, about Luther's doctrine of salvation by faith alone, sola fide. And it really was Luther trying to work out in his own mind, how can I have some certainty that I'll go to heaven when I die? And so that note of certainty of salvation is really what drove it. Well, John Calvin another Protestant theologian in the 16th century, was a better systematician than Luther. Luther really theologized out of his experience. Calvin was better at sort of building theological systems, and he takes that note of personal assurance and really develops it into a dogma of Protestant faith that got instantiated, if you will, in doctrinal statements like the Westminster Confession or the Synod of Dort. These are Calvinist doctrinal confessions that teach that a man once born again, truly born again, will not fall away definitively from the faith. They called it the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints. And that raised a problem, right? Because if you believe that a truly born again person can't fall away from the faith, well, what about all the people that are baptized that seem obviously to fall away? Because not everybody who is like visibly a Christian or in communion with the church keeps their faith. And so what Calvin did was a little bit strange. He came up with a new idea, never before heard in Christianity. Calvin admitted that baptism, in fact, regenerates and saves people, but he said, well, it only works in some people. It only works in the elect. All right? So he acknowledged that baptism can convey regenerating grace. He just said it doesn't happen to everybody. And here's another thing. He said it doesn't necessarily happen at the moment that the sacrament is conveyed. So there could be some lag time.
Yeah.
You could baptize a baby, and then the fruits of the sacrament might kick in when they're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, or whenever.
Yeah.
Okay. And then in Puritanism, now we're moving into the 17th century, the big question was, well, how do I know if I'm one of the people in whom salvation has kicked in? And for a lot of Puritans, the evidence that a person was really born again was the moral quality of their life. And that's why today, when you hear Puritanism, you usually think of a very rigorous, moralistic environment. You know, they're running around burning witches and wearing funny hats, okay? and there was that note. There were a lot of Puritans that were very, very rigoristic in their approach to morality. There were also Puritans that went the other way and said, no, works cannot serve as evidence of being regenerated, and it's just faith, and that's it, and it's interior religious experience alone. And so Protestantism in the 17th century went into this big crisis, this ferment over the question of how do I know I'm one of the people, same problem Luther had, how do I know if I'm one of these people in whom grace has sort of taken hold? And by the time you get to the 19th century, that the insistence that I be able to know absolutely for sure that I'm going to heaven no matter what became so overwhelming in the way this question was framed that they emphasized just the experience of personal conversion as the be-all and end-all of Christian faith. Yeah. All right? So your intuition is correct. This is not a development of a biblical doctrine. It's the development of a concern that Luther placed in Protestantism from the beginning that had its own sort of theological development over the centuries and is only intelligible. It's not intelligible in light of the Bible. It's intelligible in light of the history of Calvinism and how the Calvinist movement tried to work out these Lutheran themes to their own satisfaction. And to the best of my knowledge, the first person who ever taught explicitly all you have to do to go to heaven is to pray to receive Christ in the sinner's prayer was an American preacher named D.L. Moody, right around the turn of the 20th century, 19th to 20th century. And he reduced salvation to this formula. And then that got picked up by guys like Billy Sunday, Bill Bright of Campus Crusade for Christ, and especially Billy Graham, who really popularized this around the world.
Oh yeah.
But you're absolutely correct. If you pick up the Bible and read it, Jesus doesn't look like he says anything even close to this. And in fact, Luther saw that problem too. Luther recognized that Jesus did not teach the gospel as he understood it. And in Luther's preface to the New Testament, he actually says, you can't learn the gospel by reading the teachings of Christ. It's one of the most amazing admissions in all of Luther's writing, all right?
Yeah.
Basically, if you want to learn the gospel, Luther said, you got to read St. Paul, and you got to read him with me at your elbow telling you what he meant.
Wow.
And so there's a thumbnail sketch on the history of Protestant dogmatics from Luther to Billy Graham.
Okay. Sounds like hubris to me.
Yeah.
Just a little. Anyway, thank you so much for your call, Mike. We do appreciate that. This is Call to Communion here on EWTN. I want to let you know about one of our divisions here at EWTN, and that is CNA, the Catholic News Agency. Or if you're not familiar with it, maybe you've heard about the Register. You've been to the Register's website. You're missing out on if you don't go to Catholic News Agency. This is the only fast, reliable, and free Catholic news source that brings blogs, stories, opinions, and more to your fingertips. Looking at the CNA news site right now, one of the stories they're following, undocumented teen has an abortion following court approval. You may have heard about that in the news. Here's one, what it's like to be a missionary in the Central African Republic. Or what about this one? Cardinal Vidal, who just recently passed away, remembered as a peacemaker and a pastor. Here's another one. The tradition of sacred choral music needs to be revived. This is the kind of great stories that you're going to find on the Catholic News Agency website. You can go there by going to CatholicNewsAgency.com, just like it sounds. CatholicNewsAgency.com. It's an online service from EWTN. And we're glad to bring it to you. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Lori is standing by. She's listening in Tacoma, Washington on Sacred Heart Radio. Hey, Lori, what's on your mind today?
Just a real quick question for you. When we die and we're given that we must go to purgatory to get purified to go to heaven, what is the difference between, what kind of suffering would that be compared to those going to hell?
Thanks. I really appreciate the question, and it's incredibly different. It's absolutely qualitatively different, hell and purgatory. Everybody who's in purgatory loves God and is united to Him in charity and is filled with hope.
Does that make sense?
Right? I'm not done yet. I'm not done yet, okay?
Go ahead.
Everybody in purgatory is united to God in charity and is filled with hope and has absolute confidence in their eternal salvation, all right, because they've died in God's friendship, all right? So if nothing else, the interior quality of the life of a soul in purgatory is very good, right? And they pray to God, and they most theologians think they can pray for us, and they pray for the universal church, and they're having a rough time, all right? Well, we have a rough time on earth too, but you can still be united to God in charity and have a rough time, all right? But the soul in hell is filled with despair. The soul in hell hates God and is not united to Him in charity and is filled with despair. So everything else being equal, even though it's not equal, right? The interior life, which is really, that's the real life, right? How we think and feel and reflect on things, the interior life of a soul in hell and the interior life of a soul in purgatory are just diametrically opposite, okay? Now, so that pain of loss, right, is the principal pain of hell, and there's also pain of sense, right, which, tradition and Scripture associate with fire. Now, does that mean literal fire? Don't know. This differences of opinion on how literal we should take that. Right. But there's a pain of loss, okay? The pains of purgatory, a little bit less defined in Catholic tradition. Don't really know what the pains of purgatory are going to be like, just that they're going to be pains, okay? But the experience of those pains is going to be the experience of those that are united to God in charity and hope and are in communion with Him in prayer and with the universal church. Okay. So it's very different.
Okay. Does that make sense for you, Lori?
It sure does, and I just said a prayer to St. Teresa of Avila for the relief of headaches.
Oh, okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lori. Yeah, that's David's private little cross that he's dealing with today.
It's pretty public. I just announced it to the universe.
Well, that's true.
There goes my merit right out the window. That means that prayer offered for you is not going to be worth as much. Sorry.
Dang. Jane.
Left hand, right hand.
Yeah, I understand. Jane in Charleston, West Virginia, listening on St. Paul Radio. Jane, what's on your mind today? Hello, Jane.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Jane.
Hi.
Go right ahead.
Jane.
Yeah, go right ahead, please.
Okay. I do listen to your show quite often, but I do have a question because I listened to it within the last week, and I meant to write down what day it was, but I can't remember.
Jane.
Uh-oh, we lost Jane.
I think we lost Jane's connection. Not there at all. Okay.
But you know what? Matt got her question down the call screener.
All right.
I think it was a question about the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. Mm-hmm. All right. And so just, Jane, if you're still listening, basically what the Catholic faith teaches is that when we die, today, your soul separates from your body. That's what physical death means. Mm-hmm. All right. And the soul, if you are united to God in charity, goes to heaven or to purgatory. But at the final judgment, at the end of time, there will be a resurrection of our bodies from the dead. Just like Christ's body was raised, our bodies will be raised, and soul and body will be reunited. Our bodies will be changed into the likeness of Christ's glorious body, and we enter into everlasting life in an embodied state.
Okay, very good. Jane, please try us again another time, and we do thank you for your call. This is Call to Communion here on EWTN. Alex is in Crawfordsville, Indiana, listening on Catholic Radio Indy. Hey, Alex, what's on your mind today?
Hey, I wanted to thank you for your show. I enjoyed listening yesterday about the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm Eastern Orthodox, and I just wondered what the Catholic Church teaches about the Eastern Orthodox Church.
Thank you. I appreciate the question. So the Catholic Church views the various Orthodox churches, as Christians, united to the same Christ and the same God through the same sacraments in charity and the same hope of everlasting life. We regard the Orthodox sacraments as valid, the Orthodox bishops as possessing genuine apostolic succession. And so the Catholic Church regards them with a great deal of affection and closeness. And of all the Christian bodies in the world outside the Catholic Church, the one to which we are the closest in faith, practice, and charity would be the Orthodox Communion. All right, so very, very, very close relationship. Yeah. Now, obviously the one place, well, more than one, but the major point of difference is the extent of the Pope's jurisdiction over the universal church. And the Orthodox generally regard the Pope as the Patriarch of Rome and the Latin West, depending on who you ask, is exercising a legitimate primacy over that communion. But they reject the Pope's claim to operate with a universal jurisdiction. All right, the Catholic Church believes that the Pope is in fact the Patriarch of the West and the Bishop of Rome. Yeah. All right. With a special jurisdiction over that communion, but that he also possesses a universal jurisdiction over the church because of the promise of Christ. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. Give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And the keys, of course, are a sign of executive authority. We see the same thing in Isaiah 22. And so the Pope does actually exercise a universal jurisdiction over the church. And it's worth pointing out that the historical understanding of the Pope's primacy, going all the way back to the 2nd century, our earliest documentary evidence outside the New Testament, East and West, whether you look at the Syriac churches, the Greek-speaking churches, the Coptic, the Latin, whatever, there's universal affirmation of the fact that the See of Rome had primacy due to St. Peter ending his days there. It was a Petrine supremacy, and there are Orthodox theologians. There are Eastern theologians from Byzantium, like Maximus the Confessor, for example, would be a prime example, who explicitly confess their faith in the Pope's universal jurisdiction. There are Arabic-speaking Christians like Theodore Abu Qurra, not a Latin, who clearly confesses the Pope's universal jurisdiction. You see Syriac churches like the Maronites, who have always been in communion with the Bishop of Rome. The Maronites had a bishop present at the Fourth Lateran Council. The Maronite monastery of St. Maron back in the 6th century wrote a letter to Pope Hormisdas acknowledging his universal jurisdiction over the entire Christian church. So it's a Catholic doctrine, Catholic in that it was universally held throughout the Christian world. And of course, the Latin West and the Greek East grew apart culturally and had different theological and liturgical traditions that created some tension. All right, and that tension eventually spilled over into political conflict. And first with the Phocian schism and what is about the 9th century, and then of course in the 11th century we had the Great Schism.
Sure.
That finally I think was sort of solidified with the great tragedy of the Fourth Crusade.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Alex, there you go. We appreciate your call, and David, we certainly do pray for unity, although that's kind of a tall order, isn't it?
Yep.
But with God, nothing is impossible, right?
That's right. And I often say we don't know that we're not in the early church.
Well, that's true.
We might have 500,000 more years of Christianity before the end of the world. We don't know. Who knows? Who knows what God will do?
Yeah. Dr. David Anders, thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks also to Michael McCall, Matt Kabinski, and very glad to bring Jeff Burson back into the fold here, helping us out with social media. I know Michael's very happy about that. I'm Tom Price. We'll be glad to be joining you at the same time tomorrow for another edition of Call to Communion. We do it Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern. Have yourselves a wonderful day. We'll see you next time. Right